The following is a paid political program.
This is Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Tonight I want to show a small fraction of my travels across the country and the discussions I had with businessmen and farmers, housewives and workers, with individuals and with crowds in city squares.
From the green Atlantic Ocean to the wide Pacific shore, from sunny California, high South Labrador, she's mighty tall and handsome and known quite well by all. On her rugged mountains that ain't been tall, with a vast cannon fall, and listen to the jingle of the lights and roar. Ride on the with a mighty rush of engine, get a look for those songs. We're riding on the drifting, a vast cannon fall, from the green Atlantic Ocean.
We're very pleased to be here, and I want to introduce my wife to you, Miss Ethel Kennedy, and David Kennedy, and Michael Kennedy. No, Michael didn't do very well, I didn't. Okay, David, much better. And Courtney Kennedy. And then I understand that I'm going to get an elephant book. Do you have it? It's an elephant hook. I'm going to have to wait till November to try to use it. We know that we have many problems in the United States, but I think the history of this country has demonstrated that we can deal with them. And I think that we can deal with them in 1968 as we have during the history of our country. That's why I run for President of the United States.
What I want to do is start focusing on the problems that we have here in the United States. I think we focused attention on some of these matters abroad. I don't want to separate ourselves from the rest of the country abroad, but I'd like to start focusing attention on what we need to do here within our own country, because we have immense problems. What is it that we stand for? Do we stand for just improving our gross national product each year and acquiring this tremendous amount of wealth and families and as a nation? Do we think that our position around the world is dependent on the military strength of the United States, or is there something more? In my judgment, it's something quite different. It's how we treat our own citizens. I remember traveling in 1962 and 63, even when we were having trouble in the area of civil rights. What I could say, really, was that we were making an effort, that I thought that we would have trouble and problems in the future, but that we were making an effort and the country was making progress. I would like to see us return to that course. I think that's the national purpose. I think the country is the great generosity and a great spirit, and I think that we saw through the Peace Corps what people want to do, and if they're given the ability to do it, that they want to make a contribution to the lives of others. And that seems to me that over the period of the last few years that perhaps we've lost sight of. That's what I would like to, those are the kinds of things I'd like to return to.
Yes.
I think that the great questions that are affecting the American people at the moment is the divisions that exist within the United States, the divisions between races, whether we like it or not, whether we discuss it as openly as we should. It exists. The riots, the violence, the disorders, the lawlessness taking place in our cities, I know is a matter of great concern across the country. Whether the black population is going to play a role in our society, or whether it's going to continue to be alienated, and whether we can talk with one another, not only talk with one another and understand one another, and also begin to work out our problems in common with one another. Whether we're going to gaze at each other in a more and more alien way across almost impassable barriers. And I talk about now about the violence and the lawlessness and the disorder.
that affects this country. I don't think that's tolerable in this country. I don't think that we have to accept the idea that summer after summer we're going to have violence. I don't think we have to accept the idea that summer after summer we're going to have looting. And I don't think we have to accept the idea that the stain of bloodshed is going to be ever across our country.
Well, I think that we have to make it quite clear that we're not going to tolerate violence and lawlessness and disorder or rioting in the United States. I was Attorney General of the United States. I was the Chief Law Enforcement Officer. And I know how important it is to preserve law and order. We can't have this kind of violence.
What would the method be?
Well, I think that you have to move in enough force to stop it and move in force rapidly enough. That's going to be local responsibility by and large. But I think that there are techniques in which you can do so, and techniques that should be learned by local police departments so that you can deal with it. And some of the communities have been able to deal with it much more effectively than others. But I think basically it's the ability to move rapidly, to cordon off the area in which the rioting or the disturbances take place, move in with sufficient force to deal with it, and to cut it off from the rest of the community.
What's this crime in the streets thing about this? I mean, we got to get this stopped. It's going to get out of hand completely.
I agree. I think there are things that you can do in law enforcement. Well, I think violence breeds violence, and it's self-defeating, anarchy, and going to be self-destructive in the long run, damaging to the black community as well as the white community and our structure within the United States. The welfare system does nothing. Give somebody a dole, it's a payoff. You stay quiet and we'll give you a payoff every week. I think we should get away from the welfare system. Obviously, some welfare is going to be necessary either for children or the blind or the disabled, but we should get away from the welfare system and have a job system instead of that. And I think what we did is accept what philosophy of the 1930s and feel that that's acceptable in the late 1960s and the 1970s. And my judgment, it is not. I think it bankrupts the state, bankrupts the community, and bankrupts the country, just continuing the welfare system, as well as destroying the dignity of the individual and destroying the family unit. What respect can a child have for the father who stays home all of the time? Doesn't work. Well, nothing. And secondly, in so many parts of our country, the family has to break up and the children have to be illegitimate. It's completely unsatisfactory in order to getting welfare. What I think we should do instead is to have jobs and meaningful jobs at reasonable and responsible pay. And what I would do is to have the government the employer of the last resort, and secondly, I'd bring in the private enterprise system in a major way by lowering their taxes if they went into areas where there was presently unemployment or hired people who were on welfare. Give them some tax advantages for doing so. If people have jobs and they feel that if they have jobs, they will then feel that they are part of society. They feel that they have a stake in what happens. But it's people who are filled with hopelessness and who are filled with despair that turn either to violence or to lack of any kind of initiative. And so that segment of our society suffers tremendously.
On the day Bobby left the Justice Department, before going over and giving his resignation to President Johnson, he visited the Cardozo area, and it was really very moving. A small child pressed some flowers into his hand, and he had converted an old junkyard into the most beautiful playground. It's really great. 10,000 children play there daily. It's so fantastic. Anyway, she gave him the flowers, and she looked up and said, "Goodbye, Mr. Kennedy. We love you because you cared." It was really very, very nice. Then we went to the White House.
I think instead of the deep divisions within the country, that the country can come together. Not that we're going to agree with one another, because we don't want to agree with one another. We're a nation of diversity, and therefore we're going to have different ideas about how to deal with these problems. But there doesn't have to be the bitterness, and there doesn't have to be the hatred, and there doesn't have to be the distrust that exists to such a large extent in the United States at the moment. And I think part of that is the fact that the governing process has been taken away from the people. I think we should bring in the private sector, too, in a more active way. and not just have the federal government in Washington running it. Bring in the private sector and decentralize it so that it's brought back to the people and not have just programs run out of Washington. I would give tax incentives and tax credits to the private sector to build housing, for instance. I give tax incentives and tax credits to private enterprise to go into the areas of rural unemployment, to construct a plant, take people off welfare, take people who are unemployed, and put them to work. I'd have that decision made by the private sector and the local community, with the federal government just giving the tax incentives. I'd try to return the control of schools back to the people themselves and not to some central authority. That's what I think has been one of the great problems, and I wouldn't have what we have at the moment, that there is somebody in Washington that knows all, and only he is the one that can tell what should be done in Indianapolis, what should be done in Terre Haute, or what should be done in Omaha, Nebraska, whatever it might be. I don't think he's the one that knows. I think the people in the community know much better about what needs to be done. That's what I would like to see as return control. Housing is a perfect example. You go in and the federal government in Washington makes a decision that there's going to be a high-rise apartment plunk right here. And it shouldn't be that way. I'm in favor of taking that control away from Washington, returning it to local control, let people decide themselves, and then have it done by the private sector. It seems to me moving in that direction makes much more sense than the legislation that we have presently on the books and the procedures that we're following at the moment. I think one of the great problems in the country is the fact that we've lost the control in smaller communities and in larger communities, really, over the control over government and control over what we think is our future. And I think that's some of the national, when we talk about the loss of national spirit, which we mentioned a little earlier, I think some of that is due to that. As one of you mentioned earlier, people say, well, what's the use? What can we do? What difference does it make? We can't have that in this country at the moment. We can't accept that in this country at the moment. I mean, the problems are too great.
It's not just the job, per se, or the handout. It's an inspirational thing to me, in a way. I think this is why I'm for Senator Kennedy's candidacy. I think we need, it's something more than the job.
That's right.
This is what we really need.
The feeling of spirit of the country and the spirit of the individual, and you're not going to possess it in the way that we've proceeded in the past several years.
Because once we get this spirit, then we as individuals will go out. I'll stop drinking coffee in the morning and get out and do something. I'm sure that I will, but this is a thing that's really missing now.
I agree with that.
I think that we have to look beyond what we've done in the past so that we don't rely just on government. We're not relying just on Washington. We don't centralize all authority and all government and all ways of life just in Washington, that we decentralize it and we return government and the control of government to the people themselves. So I come to you for your help.
In favor of loans to small businessmen. I don't think that we've done enough of that. The interest rate now is higher than it's been for 100 years, so it's very, very difficult for a businessman to survive in the United States. They get swallowed up. So I think that the interest rate astronomically high, and I think that obviously we have to make money that is available to small businessmen, and that with our loans or lower interest rates, in either way or both ways, that should be done so that businessmen can compete and can stay in business. There has to be that understanding and explanation to those who live in cities of the importance of what you can contribute. That's what I've tried to do while I've been in the Senate. I think there's more of an understanding, but not complete understanding.
I think I can understand the farmer dilemma. He's not getting the money, but we're paying the money, and where's it going, you know? The farmer's prices go up, and so our money is much less for what we have. What
So the fact is that the farmer's purchasing power is the same as it was in 1936. The fact is that the farmer's prices have gone up over the last few years by 17%, the prices that he has to pay, and what he receives back in return for his produce has gone up only 6%. The fact is that there's a tremendous squeeze on the farmer, and the fact is that thousands and thousands of farmers are having to leave the farm and go into either small communities or to urban centers because he does not receive a fair return. I think we've got to preserve the family-type farm so that the farmer and his wife can pass the farm on to the next generation. And I'm co-sponsoring the bill giving farmers the right to bargain. And the reason I'm doing it is not because I have such a tremendous number of farmers in my own state, but I think that it's important that you do well. We are dependent upon one another. I'm in favor of the small farmer, not just because I think that the small farm is important, but from a cultural and a psychological point of view. For the future of this country, I think that kind of philosophy, the entrepreneur, the individual who runs his own business and runs his own destiny and decides his own future, is terribly important for the United States. And I think he should receive a fair return for the effort that he makes, and he doesn't do so at the present time.
Some of the different labor leaders have endorsed other candidates, and I was wondering why this would be.
Well, I think that they decided in Washington, that the AFL-CIO, George Meany, decided in Washington that they would move in a different direction in opposition to me.
Does that mean their labor union people are going to follow?
Well, I don't know whether I don't think people follow what somebody else tells them anymore. I think they decide independently themselves.
Senator, as a Teamster, I'm interested in how you stand with labor and government relations.
Good. Hit me again. I don't know what. Is it your turn or mine?
Well, how do you stand with, how's your views on government and labor?
Well, I'm in favor of labor organization. I'm in favor of the laboring man. I remember my younger brother was running for the Senate, and his opponent kept saying, you shouldn't vote for him, he hasn't worked a day in his life. And he went up to a plant and he was shaking hands one day, and the fellow came up and said to him, I heard your opponent on television last night and say you hadn't worked a day in your life. My brother was rather taken aback, and he said, don't pay any attention to it, you haven't missed a thing. But I think my relationships with labor and labor organizations is good. I've been on the Labor and Education Committee, and I think that they've always supported me in my elections. And I would hope that they would continue to support me. I understand that the international authorities in Washington are moving in a different direction, but I would hope that they would support me. I've had some trouble with the former president of your union. The greatest group of people that live in poverty are the elderly people, between 6 and 7 million people. The average Social Security payment is $25 a week for a single person, $40 a week for a couple. People can't live on that. That's the average. That means there are many that receive much less than that. I think that people should receive at least $100 a month, and at least $160 a month for couples, at least. That should be the minimum payment. And that hospital costs have gone up 40%, which creates another problem for our elderly people. I think that we should ensure that we have programs in which the elderly people can continue to make a contribution to our society and are not just retired. I introduced legislation 2 years ago along these lines. There was legislation passed last year which raised our Social Security payments by 13%, but that really only kept up with the increase in the cost of living. And with inflation of 4% a year, it's very, very difficult for an elderly person or anybody to live on a fixed income. You just don't know what's going to happen as far as the future is concerned. But I mean, you can't rely on the fact that the problem is going to disappear. We're always going to have problems. We're always going to have these difficulties. We're always going to be in a dangerous, dangerous time. And that's why we have to be strong, why our military forces have to be strong, why we have to be prepared to stand up for what we believe is right, just as we did at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which I was involved in October 1962. We also have to be prepared to make agreements where they serve our national interest, as we did the Test Ban Treaty in 1963. Ending of the testing in the atmosphere, which is save the pollution of the atmosphere by atomic particles,
for this generation of Americans and the next generation of mankind. Those kind of agreements are in our interest. So we just have to continue to make those kind of efforts. The fact is that we live with danger. And this is the most dangerous period of time in history, and we're always going to have dangerous and very difficult problems. We're never going to get rid of them. What we have to try to do is to do the best that we can with them. And the fact is in Vietnam that eventually we're going to have to go to the negotiating table. My judgment is it's better to go to the negotiating table as soon as possible, find out if we can negotiate a settlement that is agreeable to us and acceptable to us. And if there is possible, negotiate that settlement. If it is not possible, then we can always go back to the conflict again. So that's why I'm in favor of making the kind of effort. Well, I think that first I'd have to say that I was involved in some of the decisions that were made in connection with Vietnam, 1961, 62, and 63. And I think that if there's fault going to be assessed, and blame assessed in history for mistakes that were made in Vietnam, then I have to take my share. And the administration of which I was intimately associated is going to also share the responsibility when blame is assessed. Not only the administration, but me personally. So we have a commitment to the people of South Vietnam. And I think people are relying on that. And I'm opposed to unilaterally withdrawing from Vietnam, but I don't think that the policy that we've been following over the period of the last few years of continuing to Americanize the war, continuing to concentrate just on a military solution, and then put out confident predictions about what was going to happen is a satisfactory program. That's what I've objected to, because I didn't think that the course that we were following was going to be successful. But I think if we're smart enough and bright enough and courageous enough and intelligent enough to deal with it, that we can, in fact, not only help protect them so that they are not taken over by a foreign power, but also protect our own American interests. I don't concede that we have to accept the idea that once we get to the negotiating table, we're going to be defeated at the negotiating table. It's dangerous, but the other two ways of proceeding are dangerous and less productive. And I think eventually we're going to have to go to the negotiating table unless we want to fight there for decades to come. But if you think that the problems are going to be easy, and that the problems around in Vietnam or Southeast Asia or Western Europe or Middle East are going to disappear, or Latin America, for the next generation of Americans, they're not. And as we're struggling with this, you're going to be struggling with different kinds of problems. And going to have this is the most dangerous time that you can possibly live in. But that also makes it the most interesting time. As Camus said that he wouldn't exchange his time with any other time, just for that reason. We had great prestige a number of years ago around the rest of the globe, but it wasn't because of our military power and it wasn't because of our economic power. It was just because people believed in us and believed that we would do what it was right, believed that the principles that we attempted to follow within our own country we stood for around the rest of the globe, and they don't have that same confidence now. That's why we received support at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's why we were able to do the test ban treaty. And that's missing now. We can't have our top officials travel easily even through Western Europe, let alone Latin America or the rest of the globe, even through the United States itself. That seems to me unsatisfactory. I'm a Democrat and I support the Democratic Party, but I'm American first, and it just seems to me that we can do much, much better, far, far better than we have. We have to treat all of the problems that we have. We will always have them. It's a dangerous world, but we have to deal with it with candor and truth. We're going to make mistakes, there's no question about that, but if we have these principles and these ideals that we adhere to, and this national spirit that exists within this country, we have communication between ourselves, and some compassion and generosity which exists in the country if it's called upon, then I think that we can be successful. If we don't have those things, then it seems to me that we're going to move in the direction that we've moved in the last few years, which I think is catastrophic. We've done great things. I think we're a compassionate nation. I think we're a generous nation. And I think that we want to live in peace and tranquility here within our own country. I think we want to abide by the law. But I think things have fallen away over the period of the last several years, and I think we want to get them back on the right track.
Think about what has to be done in America in the next 4 years. Who has the best chance of getting those jobs done?
On June 4th, vote for Robert Kennedy.